Going live. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Cycling Physios. My name's Tim and we've got Bianca who's hiding in the background. She'll be joining us on screen in a bit. And this evening we are joined by Amy Whitehead, who is a sports psychologist who I also work with in private practice. She supports a lot of my athletes and she's absolutely brilliant. But alongside being a practicing psychologist and also an academic at university, she's also co-authored The Myths of Sports Coaching with Jenny Coe, which is a superb resource for anyone involved with sport or athletes. So although this is written from a psychology point of view, our main audience for this channel are sort of physios and sports medicine practitioners working with cyclists. But really anybody working with athletes could learn a lot from this. So we are very honoured to have Amy joining us today. Before we get cracking with the presentation by Amy and some of the discussions we're going to have around this, we put an announcement out, or Bianca put an announcement out a few weeks ago about some online education that we're putting together. And we asked for a couple of guinea pigs to test this out for us and give us some feedback. And our random name generator came out with Joanna Sadler and Ben Williams. So we'll be getting in touch with you guys and sending you a copy of the online education that we're putting together. And we'll be getting your feedback before launching to the rest of you. Okay, so Amy, do you want to sort of introduce yourselves and tell us about what we're going to be talking about this evening?
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks for the invite. So as you've already mentioned, the book is originally, we went out and asked coaches kind of what are the myths that they come across, or not even myths, like what are the common, like slight misconceptions that they see, or some of the things they're not quite sure about. So then we went out to kind of 20 experts across the world to write these chapters for us. So yeah, like you've already said, the book is predominantly for coaches, but everything we talk about tonight and everything in the book can be applicable across all practitioners working with athletes.
Absolutely.
Do you want me to kick off?
Yeah, go for it.
Thanks. So like I said, there's 20 chapters in the book, but we're just going to touch on 5 tonight. And each kind of chapter presents where the myth kind of comes from or why it might exist. And then it goes into detail around some of the literature and the research that provides kind of some truth to some of the myths or reasons why these myths exist. And there's a big kind of gender element to the book. We've got 2 chapters around why we might treat males and females differently and the myths around, gender differences. But that leads into a myth around fun. And again, why we might assume that men and women or girls and boys experience fun differently. We'll then look at things like goal setting and how we use questioning and coaching, and then look at a colleague of mine, Colin Cronin, who does a lot of work around care. So how do we show care when we're coaching, but not just in coaching, in kind of everyday life. So as a manager in work, this is something that I take on board, and I know as a physio, Tim, I'm sure it's something that you'll talk about a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to say, it's an edited book. I am not the expert in all of these areas, so I'll try and do these chapters justice. But what I'm going to do is just provide a little snippet and an overview of each one of these chapters, and then Tim, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to jump in and provide your experience from a physio, coach, and practitioner perspective. So yeah, like I've just mentioned, there's a couple of chapters in the book that are really focused on this myth around, as Luke Jones and Zoe Avner talk about, that women are a different kettle of fish. And then Ali Bose has done a really nice chapter on this myth around, or actually it's not really a myth, that female sport is seen as a stepping stone to working male sport. And we see this a lot in football, for example, but I do think we see it in many other sports as well, where women are viewed as inferior and less able, kind of below like second class, whereas the men's game or male athletes are seen as more superior. And this comes from historically in both chapters. We look at the kind of social cultural developments of gender. So even if you look back at like into the late 1800s, early 1900s, the way like fashion really dictated female participation in sport. So things like long dresses, and it like prevented women from engaging in certain sports. And if you look in the early 1900s, you see like tennis and cricket are really quite popular for females, because they wear long skirts, and not being able to show like, you know, ankles and wrists and things like that. But one of the things that was really interesting, especially if we look at a sport like football, is that actually female football was really big in the early 1900s. I think in 1920 there was 150 football teams, but by 1921 the FA put a pitch ban on women playing football, and that lasted for 50 years. So that is just one example of how kind of females have been kind of prevented from engaging in sport. Another reason, if you look at like medical history, women are viewed as frail. Exercise isn't good for reproduction, because women have the menstrual cycle. So in general, women are just viewed as weaker, or less able. And I'm sure there's so many examples of cycling, Tim. Of where, you know, still now, like if you look at, you know, the Tour de France and some of the events currently, you know, women still do shorter races. They still only have male races, and I think in cycling in particular, it's a real issue. We look at things like the gender pay gap. I know in cycling, there's a huge gender pay gap. And then also if we look at like sports science support, so for example, sports science support is becoming much bigger for females at the minute, but especially at Liverpool John Moores University within our sports science department, it's a real big area of interest, because when we look at that sports science literature and the research, it's the majority of participants are male. So, and I'm sure you guys within physio, like a lot of the research that we read, it's on male participants, but we take that information from male science and we just apply it to the female athlete and just assume that it's relevant, it's the same. So I think there's a whole kind of range of different reasons of why we might view gender, males and females, differently. And these chapters for me are really designed to just make coaches more aware, or practitioners more aware of these differences. And it's not just about, you know, coaching this type of, we need a rule book for coaching women. It's just, no, these are individuals and we need to focus on getting to know the individual, whether they're male or female. So just back to you there, Tim, of what's your experience of kind of gender and maybe just across different disciplines that you work in?
I mean, you've highlighted a lot of the key sort of cultural issues that certainly female athletes face in terms of stereotypes. I mean, I've worked in a variety of women's sport. I mean, I worked with Super League netball, for example, and, you know, they were some of the hardest working, toughest athletes. And, you know, I've worked both codes of rugby, and the netballers were just as tough as the rugby players when it came to their workouts and, you know, how seriously they took it. And I think, you know, when we look at, you mentioned cricket there before, and of course what we're seeing in the women's game in cricket, I know we're going very off topic from cycling, but the Indian Premier League, obviously their recruitment that's been happening this week, and there's now some serious money coming into the women's sport there. So, you know, hopefully this is going to then cross over into other sports, and you know, the women's football is maybe again a more popular one in certainly maybe sort of UK awareness of women's sport, particularly with successes of the England team. But of course, within cycling, I mean, again, you've touched on the same challenges there in terms of distance is not the same, the pay is not the same. There's been an ongoing battle to try and get even things like the Women's Tour de France up and running again. And we had a good chat with Emma Pooley in a previous episode and talking about this. So it's an uphill battle for sure. I think one thing I would mention is absolutely that there is the lack of research in using female participants. Historically, most of the research is in, WASPs, as in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant males. And most research is done on university age individuals because that's who you can get hold of to do this kind of research. And I think certainly over the last few years, there's been this big sort of push to consider the female of the species and maybe thinking that, and again, you touch on this in the book, that, are females any more special than males? And there's been a lot of thought and consideration into, as you mentioned, things like the menstrual cycle. And I think we're at danger of just going, well, yes, of course, if you have a menstrual cycle, then you're going to be different. We need to consider you differently. And there's been a lot of research and there's a lot of very sort of popular individuals in terms of sort of putting out information about this. But that's not necessarily true. And certainly, the menstrual cycle can have an effect, but it doesn't always have an effect. So I think we need to be careful that we don't sort of go too far the other way. And I think sort of looking at some of the researchers like Kirsty Sale would be a key one I would talk to or listen to. She's got a very level head when it comes to the research that she's putting out. I don't know what you think on that one.
Yeah, no, you're right. We had a women's sports science event a couple of weeks ago, and actually the point made there was that we have done a lot of research within male athletes, but let's not forget all of that and say we have to dismiss it all and just do research on female athletes. There's a lot we can learn, because cyclists are still cyclists, whether they're male or female. It's just then just touching on those differences and just making sure we're including them in the research.
Absolutely. And it goes back to the comment you made before. It's thinking about the individual in front of you, and whether they're male or female doesn't come into it. You just consider their specific individual needs and idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, and I think as well, we talk about our women having all these special needs and different things that we consider, but is that to say that men are simple and they don't need it? So I think we run the risk of assuming that men don't need special treatment or.
Absolutely. My wife would tell you that I have many special needs. So maybe it's the men that are special and the women are normal. But, So no.
Cool. All right. Well, just linking to that is the chapter around the science of fun. So Amanda Visek and Anna Frail from over in the US have done a ton of research on this concept around fun. And it links massively into this idea of gender differences, because fun is often kind of assumed that it's different depending on gender. But also there's this assumption that fun is more about youth sport. And once we get into that kind of serious terminology around athletic development, fun and athletic development don't really kind of come into the same sentence. And going back to the gender thing, I think what Amanda's found is that when she's asked people, okay, what's fun for boys? They'll say, competition, putting in a lot of effort, whereas what's fun for girls is more being around others, less competition. So these are the gender assumptions, when she looked and asked these young people, there was absolutely no difference in how they viewed fun. And then also there's this kind of stereotype that as we get older, there's less fun involved. And again, these 11 fun factors which she comes up with don't really change significantly across gender or age. So I think the big point is here, there's this focus on what she calls the gender differences hypothesis, when actually we should look at more around the gender similarity hypothesis. Because what we should be focusing on, again, is this idea of the individual and what is fun for them. And Tim, and we talked earlier about kind of your coaching and how you try and embed fun into an endurance athletes program. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I coach a wide range of athletes. Some of them take it very seriously. Some are elite. Many are, just age groupers and doing it for the fun of it. But irrespective of what level you're at, you've got to have fun. If you're not having fun, why are you doing it? That's not to say that every single session is just going to be a barrel of laughs. There's going to be some challenging workouts in there, but underpinning it is you've got to be having fun. And to really kind of reinforce that, I use sessions like Shinrin Yoko, which is Japanese for forest bathing. So it's an idea that's come out from that in terms of mental health. But it's getting people just to go out and run or ride your bike or just get outside just for the love of going for a run or going to ride your bike, and not pay attention to what your bike computer or your watch is telling you. Just look up, enjoy the scenery and take it all in, and just remember why you're doing it in the first place. Other sort of random sessions, one that I learned from an old friend of mine, Howell Davies, Coin of Destiny, where you stand at your front door, flip a coin, heads turn left, tails turn right, come to a junction, flip a coin, and you just see where you get to. You don't know what you're doing. You're just heading out for a random run, and you can have some great fun getting lost and hopefully find your way back home again. And other sort of random exercises like that, but just put a bit more variety in there, a bit more fun in there, and just remember why you do this in the first place. Not every session has to be serious and focused.
Yeah, and I as an athlete that you coached, Tim, I can vouch for that. So yeah, and I think looking at things like within endurance sport, like just removing the data and choosing an activity for the week, I think sometimes we can get bogged down in what the numbers are saying, which make it not fun.
Yeah.
And then going back to as a sports psychologist, I always ask the question, why? So why do you do this sport in the first place? What is it that got you there? And then the fun and enjoyment has to be kind of at the forefront of that. And sometimes I think a lot of athletes, especially endurance athletes, kind of forget that when the Garmin or Strava's telling us that our performance numbers are dropping.
Yeah, that session was unproductive when actually it was exactly what it should have been. And we've got to remember that the data that a lot of us are using, whether it's power numbers, heart rate data, all these kind of metrics, but they're only a small part of the overall picture. It's learning how to use the subjective information as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Thanks, Tim. Okay, we'll jump on to the next one, which links actually in terms of like goal setting. So Tim, you've just given a really nice example there of not setting a specific goal for a training session. And Laura Healy and Des McEwen have unpicked goal setting really nicely within this chapter. And there's a lot of research at the minute around types of goals that we set. So traditionally, back in I think in the 80s, when there was the SMART goals kind of first emerged, and the goal setting theory, which has these 4 kind of tenets that goal setting directs attention and effort towards goal related activities. Goals can energize the individual. Goals can foster persistence, and goal setting encourages the adoption of task relevant strategies. So for me, these are quite taken for granted terms. So goal setting is such a broad terminology, and there's so many types of goals, so many conflicting goals. And we shouldn't assume that goal setting is the same for all athletes. And for me, that's the biggest underpinning message within this chapter, is that, again, it's really important that we get to know the athlete in terms of what drives them. And a lot of the research that's actually been done on the effectiveness of goal setting provides us with a null hypothesis. So there's about 50% of the research that uses goal setting or tests goal setting that doesn't show any improvement in performance. So I think that's a really important consideration when we are setting goals and thinking about, is this the right goal for this person? When we talk about types of goals, so are we using goals that are too difficult, or are we using goals that are too easy? And the most kind of prominent research of effective goal setting talks about these moderate difficult goals. And it's a really nice study by Wolf. I can't remember what year it was, but basically in cycling, she had an avatar. So the participant would race an avatar. If the avatar was too far away, then the participant would give up. If they couldn't see the avatar anymore, then they would give up, or they just wouldn't put in as much effort. When the avatar was just in front and would turn their head slightly, that would be the time when the most effort was put in. So for me, that's a real important implication, especially for coaches when we're working with individuals, or as a physio, Tim, when you're kind of setting rehab exercises or a rehab plan, is to think about, how confident is that person to be able to do that goal that you're giving that athlete. And also the chapter talks about athletes having a specific goal setting style. And if we look at individuals and we look at like the histories and the biographies of people, this will be very much dependent on, how they've been brought up, what is important to them. So for example, some people really focused on outcome. And although outcome, I would always advocate against being solely focused on outcome, that might be what makes that person tick. So them numbers when you're working with them, being solely focused on that event, for example, and performing at a certain time. Or is someone do they just care about enjoying the activity and just doing something during that week? And what are their expectations when setting that goal? So Laura and Des provide some really good questions for coaches to think about when they are setting goals. So when we sit down with a client or an athlete, we want to think about, what is that person's individual view on goal setting, and what are their preferences? How do they feel about the targets that are being set? And then how committed are they? So asking those questions are really important. So if we look at kind of the self-determination theory, for example, that says that to improve someone's motivation, one of the key components is that they feel they've got autonomy. So giving them the ownership and getting them to come up with the goals gives them that choice, that autonomy, which hopefully is they're more likely to kind of engage and adhere to that goal. So again, this is just about awareness raising for coaches and practitioners to think about in terms of how we work with athletes to set goals. And then, how do we feed back on them goals again is a really important consideration. Over to you, Tim.
Yeah, so, in healthcare, we talk about patient-centered goal setting. So it's not a case of us dictating, what somebody should be able to achieve. It's really making sure that they are an integral part of that decision-making process and very much kind of leading that decision-making process. And you sort of touched on the sort of maybe challenges or historical issues with goal setting when it comes to athletes, in that the coach tells the athlete what they should be doing, whereas what we know is athletes are far more successful when they are picking the goals, and it's more the coach is there to help fine tune and sort of guide them through that process, but making sure it's very much athlete-led. So in the same way that, if you're a physio working with a cyclist or healthcare professional working with a cyclist, it's making sure that, the cyclist is leading that goal-setting exercise. You mentioned about outcome goals, and outcome goals are certainly, important and can be very important for some people. But, again, what I really reinforce is those process goals that are going to lead towards that outcome. So even if maybe the outcome isn't achieved, so if it is I want to get back to racing and I want to win this particular race, if they don't actually win, but actually they've nailed all of those process goals, they can still reflect back and go, well, actually, yes, that was successful because I've achieved all those stages. It just happened to be that when it comes to an outcome goal, finishing in a certain time or finishing in a certain position, those things are outside of your control. So it's learning how to control those controllables within the goal setting exercise as well. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So moving on now to this concept of questioning. And for me, this links not just to coaching, but to any person working with a client, or, even if you're running a meeting or you're trying to engage another person into some kind of learning process. And Mark Partington is an elite level coach himself. He's done a lot of research and analysis on how coaches use questioning. So he's filmed a lot of coaches and looked at kind of the percentage of time they might use questions and what type of questions that they might use. And I think there's been a big phase, or it's fashionable at the minute, or it was, to adopt questioning when we work with clients. But the problem lies in the types of questions that we ask. So a lot of coaches fall into the trap of asking very closed questions or kind of divergent questions. Convergent questions, which are closed, so they only allow the person that you're working with to provide a very narrow answer. Or a lot of the time, it might be that you're asking a question where the person you're working with is just regurgitating the information that you've given them. So it doesn't necessarily mean that asking questions leads to learning. It could just mean that it leads to good memory, or it leads to someone agreeing with what you're saying. So he talked a lot about how when we do use questioning in coaching or working with anyone, we should look at more divergent questions, so more open questions that challenges almost the athlete or the client, and questions possibly the thinking about that topic that you're working with. But one of the things that we've talked about, especially with questioning and coaching, is around the athlete needs to feel psychologically safe to be able to answer some of these questions that might be quite challenging. So it's really important that we, especially when we're working in a group setting, that we are providing an environment where the wrong answer is okay. And a lot of coaches have talked about how they've tried to use questioning, and because maybe the athletes don't feel safe, they're not getting any answers, or there's a silence across the room. Sometimes that happens with my students in a lecture. And Tim, you're smiling. I'm hoping you understand.
Yes, I'm sure all teachers and lecturers can relate to that one.
But yeah, so it's really important that we think about the questions that we might ask prior to a session as well. So how might we pre-plan some of our questions when working with clients or athletes or teams? And in psychology, questioning is so important. So sometimes the way we phrase questions helps our client to answer it in a way that they're kind of helping themselves to understand their own thought processes, and sometimes answering their own questions or problems. So again, there's no, what you'll notice with a lot of the chapters, there's no kind of, this is exactly what you need to do, but it's just more about raising awareness for coaches, just to start to get them to think about, okay, am I asking questions? Are they the right questions? And what type of answers am I getting from the clients or athletes that I'm working with. Tim, do you think about questions or use questions when you're working with clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's integral to everything that we do in terms of, as healthcare practitioners, we need to be asking questions to gather information about our clients. And, you're saying about building that relationship and that rapport, within cycling medicine, we can be asking some, quite sensitive and very personal questions, particularly around things like saddle health. And you need to build up a relationship with whoever your client is, whether they're an athlete or patient, so that they, as you mentioned there, feel comfortable enough to answer those questions, and it's not just silence or ignoring it. So, yeah.
Yeah. And going back to, I mentioned the self-determination theory in a previous one. Questioning is really important for so our athletes feel heard or that they're being listened to. So by asking questions and getting their input sometimes into a session that you're doing, I think is a really important determinant of making them feel part of the session, and that you value their opinion. It's if we look at, we call it autonomy supportive coaching, and questioning is a really big part of that. So we're saying to the athlete, we care about you, we care about what you've got to say, and we care about your opinion. I think what I always get when I'm delivering these kind of podcasts or webinars is there's so much connection between the chapters.
Yeah, I'll just come back on that one. I had a master's student of mine, Damien Kimber, who did a really, really interesting piece of work on cauda equina, so compression of the nerves at the very base of the spine. And we have to ask some quite sensitive questions to determine, is there a problem with these nerves? And these are sort of standard questions that we use in healthcare. And the title of his research paper is, are we asking the right questions, and are we asking the questions right? Because a lot of it comes down to, the language we're using. So we might be asking a question, but that question might be heard very differently by the recipient. So yeah, I mean, you've kind of touched on that. I just wanted to bring that in. So again, any physios watching this, I'd encourage you to look at Damien Kimber's work. We've got some, his poster's been published, and we've got his actual paper out for publication at the moment. So hopefully that should be coming out soon.
Great. Yeah, I think you posted that. That sounds really good, Tim, and a really great example from your context.
Yeah, he did some really, really good work there. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, and the final chapter that I'm going to talk about, again, tying into everything else, is about this idea of care. So my colleague at Liverpool John Moores University, Colin Cronin, does a lot of research around this concept of care. And I think if we think about people like Brailsford and some of this negative kind of press and news that have come out, is that we need to be cruel to be kind, and this is coming out across all sorts of sports around coaches being bullies, being quite awful basically, and but then you constantly hear this thing, well, maybe coaches need to be like that to produce medals for athletes to become elite, to the best in the world, when personally I think that's a lot of rubbish. And then when we use these terms care, it's predominantly the care literature, and this word care comes from a real feminine place. So if we look at care in careers, we look at things like nursing, childcare, that kind of thing, and they're predominantly female practitioners. So when we start to use the word care within coaching, then people start saying, well, what does that mean? Just because we use the word care, it doesn't mean we have to hug people all the time and check in and ask people if they're okay all the time. I think this notion of care is more around knowing your athlete's wants and needs. And again, it's about knowing the athlete. So you can still push them hard in a training session because you know that that's what they need. and you're still showing care in that way, but it's knowing when to push and when not to push, in that ultimately in the best interests of the athlete. And if we look at kind of the traditional traits of, a good leader or a good coach, if you look in the, mid 1900s and you read about what does a good leader look like, and these traits of being tall and athletic and well educated and men, often kind of it was evident back then. This great man theory, which comes like from the military. And there's also this idea that a coach always has to be in control. So the coach is the expert, the coach is the person who dictates everything that happens. And there's this real power dynamic between the coach and athlete, when actually for a coach to care, all they need to think about is how they're, being observant. Are they listening? So Colm talks about this term of engrossment. So how often do coaches just sit and or stand and watch and really think about what does this client need at this particular time? And then obviously, this links to Sophia Jarlett's work in coach-athlete relationship. If we show care in whatever form that looks like, then ultimately this is going to lead to flourishing, which we would think would lead to improved performance. So Colm's chapter kind of tries to dispel this myth around being cruel to be kind, and that kind of bullying behaviours and being super autocratic and a dictator isn't necessary to create successful athletes.
Absolutely.
In terms of, Tim, I know you're a caring coach, but what would you say the key characteristics of a caring coach?
Well, so you're putting me on the spot because, as you touched on before, I am actually your coach. So hopefully you consider me to be a caring coach. I mean, that's it. It's about building that relationship. And that's what coaching is. It's about building relationships. And it's understanding the individuals. Some people do need to be, they want to be pushed and they need that kind of strength to push them along. And other people, do need a lot more hand-holding and supportive. I mean, obviously I've got a range of different athletes, and my relationship with those athletes is different. It's a very individual one. Yeah, thanks, Bianca, sitting in the background. Hopefully this is a safe place. So I think what you need to understand there is, what does that individual athlete need? I'm just being reminded of a very interesting learning experience I had as a student physio. So I was working at a military rehab centre, and it was basically young parachute regiment trainees, sort of recruits, just before going through to their P company. So fairly young lads, but trying to be fairly macho. But they were broken and injured, and the physio treatment was just in one big hall with just curtains in between each cubicle. And the physio that I was shadowing was in one cubicle being very soft, very calm, very gentle with this young recruit, and then going next door to the other one and absolutely going nuts at him and, basically screaming at him. And then going back to the other curtain and being soft and calm and gentle, and then go back there and giving him hell. And it was just this absolute, dichotomy of kind of who this person was, and that was a lesson that you've got to adapt your style to the person in front of you. So yeah, some people need to be very much cajoled through, and other people might need a slightly stronger hand. But hopefully, I mean, what you might then feed back is, as an overall pattern with me and my coaching, and hopefully with most of the people out there, is it is a caring, supportive, building that relationship, and that goes back to a lot of things you talked about already this evening, isn't it? About building
Yeah.
relationships. And if we think about, physios looking in on this talk today, we're often very fortunate to have maybe more time with our athletes compared to maybe other members of their health professions, particularly the kind of medics who might get a very short period of time with an athlete or with a patient. So we can spend a bit more time building that relationship up in order to offer that care.
Yeah. And I will vouch for you, Tim, as a caring coach. And I think for me, one of the biggest key factors in this is communication. So like linking back to some of the other things we've talked about, by asking me what I need or what I want from, a training session, and listening to, some weeks might be harder than others. There's other things going on, and helping me to adjust to that shows me that you care. If I told you I had a really bad week and then nothing changed in my training plan, I'd be thinking, well, he's not really listening, he's too busy, he doesn't care. So I think that they're just really basic examples of how to be caring. And also like for physios or, even doing bike fits, it's how can you like show that you're listening, but how can the athlete or the client, how can we get information from them? Because it's a two-way process. So we need the client to be able to tell us what they need in order to be able to care. So that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the bike fitting side of things, I mean, my work is probably slightly, or my experiences are slightly biased because of the fact that I'm a physio. So people are often coming to me having already had bike fits elsewhere from a non-medical practitioner, and maybe they've gone in with an injury, but they've just been fitted generically to the bike, and they just felt they haven't been listened to. Therefore my bike fitting style is, maybe more outside of the box at times, but because I'm listening to the individual's needs, not just fitting to a textbook idea of what they should look like. And Bianca, who's hiding in the background as well, obviously as a physio, her experiences are going to be fairly similar, that we see people who maybe are a bit more complex, who have had bike fits elsewhere, and often the feedback we get after a bike fit from someone is exactly that, you've actually listened to me and taken on board my needs. So
yeah, and if someone can leave your care feeling cared for, I think that's such a huge thing. Rather than just going, yeah, great, I had I got this feedback from a bike fit, but I actually felt really cared for. I think that's so important. Okay, awesome. Thanks, Tim. So yeah, that's me for this webinar tonight. As you can see there's a list of the 20 myths. We have got another myths part 2, which Tim actually will possibly do a webinar on in the future on myths of stretching.
Just got to finish that off. I know, yes. I'm a little bit behind schedule.
Yeah, but the next book will be Myths of Sport Performance. So looking at more of a wider sport science approach. So we've got things in there from myths of stretching to myths around sleep, to myths around, does winning or, make us happy? So are our gold medal athletes, super fulfilled and happy? To just general myths around leadership and, why myths exist. So that's just a small snippet of book 2, which will be out at the back end of this year. But thank you very much, Tim and Bianca, for the invite, and I hope everyone has enjoyed the session.
Yeah, thanks very much for your time. And I think Bianca just put up there, obviously very relevant books for physios in general, but I think, as you mentioned here, a lot of the chapters don't necessarily give you an answer. But what this book is very useful for is just really improving your skills at questioning what you believe to be facts, and training you to not take things at face value, or whatever you think is true, but just give you that skill set to go away and just ask the questions of, is it really true? Or there's going to be an element of truth to behind all of this. These ideas start somewhere, it's just, I think, one of the things I really took away from your book was it's a really good demonstration of how to critically think and question everything. And that's a really important lesson that I try and get through to all of our master's students and undergraduate students as well. So, yeah.
Thanks, Tim.
Okay. Bianca, you're hiding in the background, sort of monitoring the chat. Is there anything you want to add in? I can bring you back in. There you go. You're back in the
we're all good. Yeah, sitting here all cozy in my little hoodie.
Excellent. So you've already put up Amy's social media links. So if you want to follow Amy, then you can find her on Twitter, I think, and on Instagram as well. And obviously, we'll put the links up to the books. Amy, do you want to just give us a shout out of where's best to actually buy the book?
Yeah, Amazon is probably the easiest place, and I think there's a discount, so it's roughly around $13.99. So it's an absolute bargain.
So, for a textbook like this, that's a very, very good price, isn't it? So thank you very much for your time this evening, and we'll be back. Well, Bianca, have we got another one lined up already or not?
TBC, so watch this space.
Right. So keep an eye on the social medias, and we'll have another These Cycling Physios webinar soon. Okay. Thank you very much for your time.